All right, let's see who we got here. Let's see, I got Jane, Carrie, Brian, James, Priscilla, Scott. Okay, good deal. All right, so you can either chime in or you can just raise your hand. I'll see it down in the corner here. So, Scott, loud and clear. Good. Carrie, hello, sir. How are you, Carrie? Good to see you again. And Hill, oh, sir. Okay. Must be Irish. All right, very good. Well, I'll tell you, it's okay. We don't take ourselves seriously around here, especially with this technology, Priscilla. No worries. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today over the next three roundtables now is really medical legal issues as they arise. And of course, what you'll note most importantly is that, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the test is going to come from, the National Registry test. So if you know these slides, you're in good shape. This is well publicized or well shared. And quite frankly, I didn't see anything wrong with them. They may be a little bit too much in depth. I think they probably wanted to make sure that they covered everything. However, I think they may have gone a little bit too far. In any event, let's get started. I'm going to fly through some of these slides. So the ones that I stop and pause on to talk to you about are going to be ones that you'll want to pay attention to. Let's start out with some definitions. There's nothing on here that's testable, but let's talk about a few of these things. Consent, refusal of care, confidentiality, advance directives. Consent, refusal of care, probably the largest area of medical legal lawsuits against EMTs and paramedics is the refusal of care. This is where you guys get on the scene and you don't follow through with the appropriate policy steps, or for some reason or another, you accept the person's first comment as, well, I don't want to be transported to the hospital yet. As it turns out, the patient has some sort of incapacitation about them, whether it's intoxication or from drugs or alcohol or head injury or something along those lines. And you accept the refusal, and then, you get a call the next morning where the guy went to bed and woke up dead the next day. This is the same thing for chest pain, shortness of breath, and such like that, where an appropriate against medical advice consent form was not signed. So just know that refusal of care is the biggest liability for EMTs and paramedics. Confidentiality, HIPAA, you guys have been HIPAA'd out. Everybody's been beat to death from a HIPAA standpoint. Just whatever it is, don't share it. Advanced directives, from a patient standpoint, it's what they want to put forward to talk to you guys essentially at a point where they can no longer talk to you. So they'll talk through this written instrument. Tort and criminal actions. There's two types of lawsuits in this country. There's two ways to enter the law system. One is criminal action. We're all very familiar with that. Do something wrong, end up in jail, go to court. The second is a civil type of action, not criminal, but civil. And instead of using the word civil, which is two syllables, and that's a lot of syllables for a lot of lawyers, so we try to keep it to one syllable. It's called tort, English law derivation. Evidence preservation, statutory responsibilities. We're getting into local policy and procedure, state policy and procedure regarding what are you allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. Statutory responsibility is a cute way of saying scope of practice. Evidence preservation means don't be moving dead bodies until the police, let you in there to move them. So lots to talk about. Now, some of the ethics that's out there: mandatory reporting, spousal abuse, child abuse, elderly neglect, child neglect. These are all very hot topics, and you're a mandatory reporter as an EMS person in the state of Texas or whatever state that you happen to be in right now, since all 50 states have enacted this. This is a piece of cake. You're all mandatory reporters. You can report just about everything that's minutia, and you'll never get in trouble. If you fail to report just one and it turns out to be something, that's where you get into trouble for not reporting. I'll tell you how egregious this came about. It was an Iowa case where a pediatrician was really pissed off at his patients, and mother and father, and really felt that, you know, they were kind of neglecting the child in a way, but it was a real stretch of the imagination. So he reported them, and he reported them under the pretense that, yeah, I want to screw with these people. So yeah, I'm going to call them out. Well, they countersued, and it went to court, and the judge said, look, I know it's egregious, and I know that he probably shouldn't have done that. We'll refer him to the state medical board. But from a law standpoint, he's a mandatory reporter. If he had even an inkling of a suspicion, he is mandated to report. Case dismissed. Now, the state medical board, of course, took some action against him for not being forthright and honest and kind of screwing with patients. But you should know, from a law standpoint, that's how strong the law is. You can report, even if you're egregiously erroneous about it, you're not going to be held liable. It's one of those, what they call an absolute immunity. It's just incredible how powerful the reporting protections are for EMS. So don't be afraid to report anything. Be afraid of saying, should I report it or should I not report it? Report it. If you think about it, do it. If it's one of those cases you say, hey, this could be reportable, report it. Ethical principles, moral obligations, end-of-life issues. Hey, we got two real hot topics here. What do you do when you arrive on the scene of an 80-year-old male who's been going through chemotherapy for 3 years? He wants a DNR. His doctor signed it. He signed it. Everybody has signed it. The guy's emaciated. He's chemotherapy. He's flexion contractured. He's curled up in bed, and he just wants to die at home. Family calls and says, we think he passed away. You get on the scene and you look at this poor guy and you see the family grieving and say, he's finally at rest. He's finally at sleep. And what's the first question you ask? Does he have a hospital DNR? Yeah, he does, but we can't find it. What do? You may have a moral obligation to say to everybody, yeah, I'll honor it, even though I don't have the legal justification sitting in front of me. In other words, the out-of-hospital DNR. Do I start CPR on this person? Am I legally bound to start treatment on this guy, especially CPR, beating out his chest and such like that, and somebody who's obviously chronically ill in advanced stage? And so some of the moral issues that come about with this kind of decision-making that you have to make out there and using your best judgment. This is where moral and ethics really, really come into play. Nobody's been successfully sued or otherwise had legal action taken against them for not instituting life-saving measures just because an out-of-hospital DNR cannot be located within the home. Everybody says, well, I'm worried about my license. I'm going to get suspended. Blah, blah, blah. Trust me, if we get the facts of the case as an EMS committee on the disciplinary commission, as I sit there and I review these cases, if it has to come up with an ethical issue like that, I defer to the judgment of the paramedic unless I have manifest evidence to the contrary, which is very, very heavily weighted against you. And that hasn't happened yet. Haven't allowed one of those to go through disciplinary committee at all in Texas. So as far as that's concerned, when you're faced with that kind of dilemma, don't worry about it. We're not going to bury you. Okay. Now, they say about do no harm. I'm not going to put anything here, in here that's in the test here right now. Provide competent emergency care that conforms to standard care. Consent is permission to render care. Person.
Hey, Dr. Frame, I think James Tajanan said he has a question.
Oh, what happened to my questions? I am so sorry about that. James. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
No worries, Dr. Frame. I just had a quick question on here in New York, we're getting a lot of chatter about, we have a lot of different cultures, obviously, here in New York, and it's a big melting pot for a lot of different types of people that are coming from overseas. Behaviors are not always the same as we would have expected maybe 20 years ago. In terms of mandatory reporting, what's your guidance on sort of reporting behaviors that may not be sort of, I don't know what the word for maybe mainstream, or, you know, they're not sort of culturally the same as we would have been used to 20 years ago, but are now sort of more endemic in the population. Is there any kind of guidance on that?
Yeah, the guidance is use your best judgment. Whatever your good faith tells you, whatever your best judgment tells you is the way to go. Now, keep in mind, no matter how many different cultures that we have that come into this country from around the world, that they still follow U.S. law. So Sharia law and some of the other laws of other places that are out there, one who lives in the United States cannot exert that culturally this is our tradition and our laws, therefore we will be allowed to carry out our own laws. In the US, we say no, there's one set of laws, it's the United States of America laws, and whatever cultures, whatever different sensitivities are out there to other cultures, as you so put it, they're not allowed to have their own laws or cultures. So you have to follow US law. You have to follow your rules and regulations. Now, when it comes to sensitivities, those are difficult issues. And the best thing that I can do from an ethical standpoint to advise you is to say, use your own judgment. Over the last 20 years, things have changed. You're exactly right. And subsequently, if you act in good faith and within your standard of care, you will avoid 99% of the problems. Now, James, here's one fallback, and I hate to always dump it, but this is your best fallback. And it's the same thing for an answer on the exam. Whenever you're given an option within a question on the National Registry, or whether you're given that same ethical dilemma and issue out in the field, your choice is going to be online medical control. So you get on the phone and you call me up and you say, hey, Doc Frame, I've got this, this, and this. I'm in with this type of culture, with this group of people who believe in this, this, and this. Here's the situation. What do we do? And we get it. First of all, we get it on a recording. Second is your best fallback is, hey, this is what the doc told us to do. And that's always going to fly. But as far as covering each and every ethical issue that could come about, well, I wouldn't know how to advise you on that except to say, man, use your best judgment.
Yeah, that's great guidance. Thank you. No, some of the issues here in New York specifically are there are sort of local laws that are being changed as a result of some of these cultures that are coming in and actually populating the local government, if you will. And so even the police are now sort of taking a step back when confronted with some of these cultural norms, which we're not normally accustomed to. So it's an evolving thing, obviously.
It is, and I think that you raise an excellent point, and it's not going to get any easier over the next 10 years for sure. In New York, Christ, you guys got laws out there make a lot of good common sense until you get down to the Southern District of New York, where they're cultural, like you said, a cultural melting pot, where you got a lot of culture sitting there. Plus, you throw in a dose of liberal idealism, and we've got ourselves a political situation. And I hate to advise you one way or the other as far as paramedics to tell you how to go about doing that. That's just, that's a good question, James. That's a great question. How do I go about it? Good faith, standard of care, and then call online medical control.
All right. That's great. Thank you for that.
Hey, no problem. I had one of these are starred on another screen that I have in front of me. So I want to make sure that I am giving you stuff that is going to be on the National Registry that's relevant, accurate, and reliable. Okay. Yes, and I've got this one heavily starred. Foundation. As a matter of fact, I'm going to use a 4-star system. 4 means you're going to see it. 3, you're probably going to see it. 2 and 1, you may see it. But yeah, this foundation of consent is decision-making capacity. The fundamental basis to any kind of consent as it pertains to express care, either accepting care or refusing care comes down to, do they have capacity and capability? Can you understand the information that's being given? Do you understand the ramifications if you don't accept care? And the capacity that the person is not intoxicated or otherwise, like I said in my opening remarks, had experiencing a head injury or having a diabetic situation like a blood sugar 20, these type of things. So you base it on two words, capacity and capability. So as a lawyer, when I go into a courtroom in the years that I did when I was prosecuting in Chicago, is that the first thing I would do is look at the intent. Look at the intent of the person who did or did not accept care. And so I'd ask the paramedics, geez, what were you thinking? What was going through your head when you said, yeah, we're going to accept this guy's refusal of care? And then it turns out 2 hours later, he goes to the emergency room because he's got this, this, and this. Head injury with an epidural or a low blood sugar or stroke-like symptoms. The guy who you called was having a psychotic break and just told the family, put him to bed and let's see how he does in the morning. The guy that's sitting there that's saying, yeah, I got a wife and 3 kids, when he's got no wife and no kids and the parents are real concerned. You put him to bed because he's having a psychotic break. This is an actual case. And then the next day, he's not doing much better. His family has him transported to the hospital. He's got a grade 2 bleed in his brain, and it made him psychotic. And so this was interpreted by the paramedics out there as, well, this is a psychotic break, which is a formal diagnosis. As you can tell, both of those paramedics are no longer with the Chicago Fire Department. As a matter of law, practicing with the law division in Chicago, we couldn't defend that case. There's just no way I could defend that case. You're making diagnoses out there that are unreasonable. I don't mind you making diagnoses. You just better be right. And you can have impressions. You can have clinical impressions. You can have whatever you want to call it. If you don't like the word diagnosis, well, we're not doctors, can't diagnose. I respect that. But you are allowed to make clinical impressions. And one of them has to do with this foundation of consent as decision-making capacity and capability. Now, the Supreme Court has already ruled that a person has a right to make decisions about their own bodies as long as they're of legal age and possess both the mental capacity and capability to make those decisions in regards to that moment. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but if you hammer home this foundational concept of consent as a matter of capacity and capability, you're never going to run into problems. Okay, so somebody's coughing over on the other end there.
Sorry.
No, that's okay, as long as you're feeling better. I don't want
I'm good.
have to reach through the screen and intubate you or something. All right, so patient acknowledges he or she wants you to provide care or transport. Guess what? You're transporting. Why? Because, and I hate to say this about my own profession as a lawyer, but there's a bunch of us standing in the wings who like boats, and I love airplanes. I own an airplane. I love boating. I love taking lots of vacations. And if there's a way that I can bring your butt to court, show a jury that you blew it, and that you didn't transport this patient when they requested to come to the hospital, and then something bad happened to them, guess what? I get my 1/3 cut from the $10 million verdict that goes against you in the city. Of course, what are you doing? You are now doing landscaping because you can no longer be a paramedic. So the only other job you can get is landscaping. You're going to be planting trees and flowers. Why? Because nobody will let you near a damn patient for the rest of your life. Except I get $3 million of that $10 million thing, and I get all the boats and airplanes I want. I got a real nice airplane from another type of case, not involving a paramedic. But I got to tell you something. I really want a bigger airplane. And I just looking into the crowd here to see if I'm going to get my bigger airplane from one of you all, or if it's going to be somebody else out here in Texas. My guess is it's not going to be you because you're going through PERCOM, classy class, classy course. you got good common sense and you're all self-study, which means you're all self-starters. And I like that. So I'm probably not going to get my plane with you guys unless y'all get cute out there. Then you decide you don't need to go to the hospital. Don't worry about it. Take 2 aspirin, call your doctor in the morning. It's not going to happen. All right, patient must provide informed consent. Now, here's the other side of it. You got this little tort out there called battery. You go up to the patient says, I don't want you to treat me. You say, sir, we really got to start an IV on you. I want to hook you up to an EKG machine. I want to take your vital signs. Do not touch me. So then you ask him his name, the date, his address, who the president is, what time of the year is it and such like that. Do you understand if we don't treat you that there's a real possibility of death or permanent disability? Yes. Now, how do you interpret that, sir or ma'am? I interpret that as meaning that you have given me all my options, and after reviewing all my options, I do not want you to treat me. Now, let's say you go ahead and treat them anyway, and there's no basis for consent or capacity that would raise a question with a reasonable person. Well, then you're going to be charged with a battery. Now, it's the tort of battery. It's not the criminal action of battery, unless you beat the shit out of them. But if you sit there and start an IV and such like that, and you transport them to the hospital, you say, I really did not want to be here. I am going to sue you. Trust me, they're going to have a lawsuit. So what is it with all of you guys that are sitting out there on the front lines of EMS doing the best you can at all hours of the day or night, and you're walking this real fine line between capability and capacity on one hand and failure to treat on this hand, where I could lose my license? If I do treat and the patient didn't want it, I could be sued. Where do you play all of this? And the answer is, it's complicated. It's supposed to be complicated. That's why we give you guys all the judgment. With as complex as these issues are, and as well trained as you guys are, when you red patch or whatever color patch from whatever state you're from that says, I am a paramedic, okay, wherever that comes from, it's going to be universally recognized that you deal with more complex issues than most doctors do in the emergency department. And subsequently, with the complexities, it's going to be harder and harder to sue you for anything but the most egregious of actions. Now, you should know something. Again, there's nothing on this, what I'm about to say is going to be on your test, but this makes great conversation. Yeah, you do need to go to law school, James. As a matter of fact, everybody needs to go to law school. You don't have to practice law, just get there for the education. I just happened to practice law because I wanted to be a criminal prosecutor, and I did it for a couple of years and then decided, you know what, I'm going back to medicine. These people are nuts. It's bad enough I got to see them, in the emergency room, but to see them out on the street doing what they do, it's just unbelievable. In any event, you explain the risks, you explain the benefits to the patient, then you get on the phone, you call online medical control and say, I got a 36-year-old male here. He admits to been drinking, but he's not slurring his speech. He's talking, he's alert 92 times 4, appropriate, normal tone voice, coherent. He understands the risk and benefits here. Police officers are here right now. They agree that this guy has a right to refuse. I'm putting it on the air. I'm putting it on tape. Do we accept his refusal? My answer to you is going to be, based on what you're telling me, the answer is yes, you can accept his refusal. Or I will say it very loudly over the phone, not loudly, but I'll say it over the phone where you can put it on speaker and say, please ask the police officers to take this man into custody. I do not feel that he possesses the capacity or the capability to refuse treatment, and his life is going to be in danger. Then that puts it on the police officers. Now, here in Texas, just like in other states, Louisiana for another one, the police officers make the final decision as to whether or not a person possesses the capacity and capability. Now, if they say, no, I'm not going to get an emergency detention order on him, or I'm not going to authorize him being transported against his will because I feel he's got capacity and capability, well, then you're off the hook. That's the end of it. You just document that on tape for me over online medical control, and we're done. You go to Illinois, New York, Florida, Pennsylvania, some of the other places where they say, no, it's going to have to be the doctor that makes the decision. But through it all, at the very basis of all of it, I can only make a decision based on what you say as my eyes and ears. Back to capacity and capability. When I ask you things on the phone, it isn't so much to rehash what you just told me. It's to reaffirm and re-emphasize for the jury when they're played the tape that this was asked and answered not once, not twice, but 3 times. No, no, and hell no. Okay, sounds like the guy doesn't want to do anything here. This is good. So, you know, play the game when you're on the radio and you're talking to us as online medical control and you get your recording going. Play the game. I'm going to ask you this 3 times. Okay, and he said no to that, right? Right. Does he understand that this could result in death or disability? Yes. He refused that as well? Yes, he did. All right. Does he know that if he wakes up tomorrow, he can call us, you know, just while he's on deathbed? You know, you can get a little dramatic with these people. If there's a way to not be false and not lie to them, but discuss with them possibilities, that's within your scope of practice. Now, we know anything in medicine is possible. It's not up to us as physicians to advise you over the phone what the possibility versus probabilities are. Well, let's see, he's probably got a 40% chance of death. So since it's less than 50%, you can let him refuse. 40% is a pretty damn big number. If it's 1 to 2%, you know, I may make that judgment and say to you, okay, we don't have to do this. But the bottom line is that we have to make that decision together. You are my eyes and ears out there. And you're the one that, quite frankly, is the front line. You're in the trenches. We like to think of ourselves in the trenches in the ER. Police like to think of themselves as the trenches. You guys think of yourself as the trenches. And guess what? We're all in the same damn trench. We're dealing with the same people out there. The people who are the criminals who get hurt. The people who are criminals who hurt other people. And, of course, all the other bad things that happen out there. Guess what? Fire gets to go out there, you guys get to treat the patient, the police get to arrest or at least take him into custody, and guess where they all end up? The emergency room. You're all there. And this is where we have to be together on all these issues. It never ceases to amaze me that the single most important thing, capacity and capability, and their ability to consent or refuse is such a complex issue. But every person's different. All right, so let's keep moving on. This is going to be a 3-night thing anyway, and so what I'm giving you is a lot of stuff that I ran through as a prosecutor, as well as being an ER doctor. So I want you to know how much is really at stake here. If you keep it simple, if we keep it down to consent and capability, you're going to not only pass the national registry test based on what we just talked about, but you'll survive the streets very nicely. Carrie, that's a good comment. We only call med control if we want to step out of protocol. All right. I would probably take that one step further. Your online medical control is probably your safest bet, besides having your own lieutenant captain or battalion chief out on the scene that says, no, you know, follow my orders, here we go, you know, you do this, this, and this. If you've got a situation where a person you feel should be transported, the patient's refusing and he's adamant about refusing, you may want to touch base with online medical control. And I'm sure your protocol somewhere in there says if there's any questions, comments, criticisms, or funny stories, please share them with online medical control. We'd love to get this stuff on tape and play it for a jury 2 years later when none of us can remember anything about the call. And this was the opinion of the doctor at the time. And this was the status of the patient at the time. And my report is only about, oh, yay, big, 16 lines to try and tell the whole story. And yet a picture's worth 1,000 words, and there's probably about 4,000 words per radio transmission. So I would say that combination of your written record plus the online medical control tape, I think probably puts you in a real good defensive legal position. So I would construe that comment, step outside of protocol very liberally. as saying, well, the patient's refusing care. You know, it's not a clear-cut case. There's some intoxication involved here or something. Oops, it sounds like something that is outside protocol, and start making phone calls. Okay, so hey, here's the easy stuff, implied consent. Implied consent says, and this is on the National Registry exam, you can write down whatever note you want. I'm going to talk on this slide for about 2 or 3 minutes. So glean from it what you can. Implied consent. If the patient cannot give you direct express consent, is his consent implied? Are they unconscious? Are they so intoxicated that they cannot even give you an answer? Are they so injured or ill from the respective diseases or trauma that they cannot express to you whether they want care or not? This is called implied consent. And here's the way that we look at it in a courtroom. The instruction to the jury is going to be, did the paramedic act in a reasonable manner that a normally prudent paramedic would in the same or similar circumstances? It's called the reasonable person standard or the reasonable paramedic standard. So guess what I get to have? I get to put firefighter paramedic Snuffy Smith on the witness stand. I get to ask him about everything that he did or didn't do on this call. Why did he accept a capacity capability situation where the person was not clearly possessing capacity or capability? Why did you accept refusal? And then what I get to do is I get to establish through what they call Rules 701, 702, and 703, Civil Procedure, Federal Rules of Evidence, I get to put an expert witness up there. And guess who that expert is? Right, somebody from out of town who runs the same calls that I do. So I take a Chicago firefighter and I put him up on the stand, Chicago paramedic, and then I take somebody from Detroit, New York, you know, someplace like that, big city, lots of runs, lots of legal issues. And I get to put them up on the stand and say, James Ellion's my expert witness. He's going to tell you, members of the jury, what a reasonable and prudent paramedic in the same or similar circumstances would have reacted in this case. Now, since I'm a prosecutor, guess who I'm going to put up on the stand? Somebody who's going to say that the care of paramedic Snuffy Smith was bad. And that's what results in the patient's death or permanent disability. If I'm defense, I'll put Mr. DeLeon up on the stand as a defense witness who's going to say, a defense expert witness who's going to say, yeah, after reading the record and after reviewing everybody's transcripts from the depositions and such, I've come to the conclusion that fireman paramedic Snuffy Smith acted in a reasonable and prudent manner that a well-trained paramedic in the same or similar circumstances would have acted. Expert witness testimony. So you're going to be held at a standard of what other people would have done. So when you make your decisions about these patients out there, do I accept his refusal? Do I not accept his refusal? What would 1,000 paramedics say out there? Well, 1,000 paramedics are going to say whatever I ask them to say because I'm handing them a check for $3,000 for the day of testimony to go up there and say, you screwed up. Could I get somebody to do that? Easy. Piece of cake. So do yourself a favor. Don't leave yourself open. Okay, implied consent means what would a reasonable and prudent person would have done in the same or similar circumstances had they been injured very badly. Would they have wanted you to treat them? And the answer is yes. That's called implied consent. In other words, we're going to assume or we're going to imply that you have consented had you been alert, awake, and injured in the same way. But because you're relatively unconscious or lack capability or capacity, we're going to assume. And the courts are going to back you up on that. Okay, and even if you're a little bit wrong and they come in and they say, hey, look, I really was alert and awake and such like that, it's not going to go anywhere. Error on the side of caution. Yeah, emergency doctrine. I didn't see that on the exam questions. There's 22 questions in cycle 5 that have to do with medical legal issues. And when I reviewed the 22 questions, I didn't see emergency doctrine. Implied consent is known as emergency doctrine. I don't know what to make of that statement. Remember it. That's great. Good idea to get consent from a spouse or relative. Okay, that's cool. But that's not going to be on the test either. Does this, what about everyone else, also apply to rural communities? Yes. Yep. Priscilla, it's about, there are issues dealing with the rules. Absolutely. Most people who live out in the rural areas are either farmers, ranchers, or otherwise out there for a reason because they want to be off the grid. They want to be to themselves, you know, and so there's a different mindset in rural communities and such. You're faced with different challenges out there in the rural communities, especially when it comes to ranchers and farmers where they tend to take care of themselves and have been doing so for a gazillion years and haven't had much problems up until that point. Again, you know, you take each person as they are, and you just have to roll with it. Respect them for who they are. Respect them for their thought processes. We've got a lot of political divisions in the country. Everybody respects each other, hopefully, from a political diversity standpoint, where you're going to get economic diversity. Then you're going to get cultural diversity, as James had brought up a little bit earlier. And then you're going to get racial diversity. And then you're going to get rural versus suburban versus frontier versus urban diversities. And there's as many diversities out there. The only thing I could say is that the human race, 2 arms, 2 legs, you know, that's about all that we got in common anymore. I mean, diversity is all over the place. And so, yeah, the rural communities are going to present a bit of a challenge for you. Those protocols from EMS medical directors are usually more extended protocols that have to last quite a while, almost an hour and a half, 2 hours of treatment, whereas urban settings, maybe some suburban settings where there's a hospital, you know, every 10 minutes and such, protocols are a little bit shorter because you're going to have short transport times and in the emergency department. Out in the rules, though, you got to get into prolonged treatments. You may get into Lasix, morphine, aspirin, and such like that, maybe even nitroglycerin drips. You're going to get into TXA, tranexamic acid infusions and such, just because you're so far out. And you can't count on nice, clear, crisp days where you got a helicopter flying all over the place. I mean, you're going to run into situations you're going to be transporting these patients as well. So, yeah. Short answer, yes. Rural communities definitely got their own paradigms. All right. Is it a good idea to get a consent from a spouse or a relative? Absolutely. I love pitting husband against wife from a legal standpoint. When I get him in the emergency room and the guy is laying there, you know, I feel fine, I'm going to go home. And the wife sits there and says, no, give him an IV, give him the medications, and I want him treated. You know what? I got to tell you something. Even though the patient has the right to kind of sort of refuse care, I'm not going up against the wife. Nope. Nope. I'm going to pit them both against each other. If she wants you to have it, sir, I got to listen to her. Well, I'm the patient. Yeah, and she's the wife. You know, game over. Game over. Unless you reach over and rip out your IV and walk out on your own, you deal with her. I only got to see you for 10 more minutes. You sign this piece of paper, you're out the door. You got to deal with her for the rest of the day. And I've never really had a problem when it comes to that. Always engage the spouse. Always. It's if they're on board and if they support the spouse and say, no, I don't want him to go to hospital either. You sure both of you don't want to go? You know, his life is in danger here and such like that. No, he doesn't want to go. I'm not going to tell him to go. That's the end of it. And then you call it a day. But the spouse is going to help you quite a bit. Having a police officer out there, of course, helps a lot as far as consent when it comes to capacity and capability. There's those 2 words again, capacity and capability. All right, 22 questions on this cycle, medical, legal, and ethical issues. of the 22 questions, implied consent probably has 2 or 3 of those questions. This is going to be the most heavily tested doctrine of all the doctrines. When it comes to express, implied, it's going to be implied all the way across the board. So when you look at the fact pattern of the patient, you're going to have to look at what caused the altered mental status, and then you're going to look at the vital signs. They will give you vital signs which are obvious. They will give you a mechanism of injury when they're obvious. Now, I don't know how many of you sat through my lecture on how to take the National Registry exam, and when we create questions, how we go about creating them. We create them with one thing in mind, that you're going to come back and argue the question, and we're going to make that one answer so correct that you can't even debate it. And we've been doing so successfully since 1972 when the National Registry came about. There's been questions that have to do with close calls. Well, you know, it could have been this answer, could have been this answer. Yeah, you're right. We make 2 answers that are fairly close, but one is so obvious that you can't refuse it, because the National Registry does not like debating questions with people. We really don't. We've got it all straight. We've got them all verified. We've got them all statistically analyzed. They're all good questions. So when you look at that fact pattern, you see an obvious abnormality of vital signs, a mechanism of injury, which a reasonable paramedic would, in the same or similar circumstances, excuse me, interpret that, hey, you know, this guy really took a hit to the head, or obviously intoxicated with GCSO, and then they'll make some weird number like 7 or 8, not 14. You're not going to make them a little off. We're going to make them really off. When you see fact patterns that show an abnormality that kind of sticks out at you, it's going to be an implied consent kind of issue. And you're going to have to at least take down those 3 pieces, from the vital signs to the mechanism of injury to how the patient's acting at that moment. Any one of those 3 is out of whack when it comes to consent questions. You're going to have to fly with the emergency doctrine, the implied consent answers that have to do with that. And you're going to have to, you know, do what you can to get the patient transported. Let's keep moving. Involuntary consent. Okay, now this is where it gets a little dicey. There's implied consent, where the patient's intoxicated, took such a heavy hitting head injury that he's not right, or his vital signs are, you know, 60 palpable, and he's sitting there, you know, saying, I really don't want to go to the hospital, you know, I can't do that. You know, those people are going to be implied consent. Involuntary consent's a different issue. Now, this is a, yeah, you're right about that, Scott. I learned that early in my life. You know, life is a lot easier when the wife is happy. The wife's happy, everybody's happy. All right, applies to patients who are mentally ill, behavioral crisis, or developmentally delayed. Watch this one carefully for guardianship. And guardianship comes about as a result of a person being incapacitated. Now, this is different from durable power of attorney, or so-called power of attorney for healthcare privileges. Durable powers or healthcare we'll talk about later in the 104 slide 3-night lectures that will come about talking about. And we'll do about it in such a way where I'll give some pretty good examples. But when it comes to patients who are mentally ill, in a behavioral crisis such as exacerbation of schizophrenia, exacerbation of bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or developmentally delayed. Now, developmentally delayed, these are, they're going to be pretty obvious. We're not talking about the autistic person who may be superior in one aspect and developmentally delayed in others. We're talking about the person with cerebral palsy, mental retardation, etc., usually from birth injuries or some other horrendioma, such as a bad car accident, bad head injuries, and such. Then we got a behavioral crisis in the mentally ill. These 2 run hand in hand with each other. I refrain from using the words mental patients, except when it comes to capacity and capability. Then I'll ask about psychiatric history. But if the patient is sitting there, and one of the worst people in the world to deal with is a bipolar patient, because they still got all their smarts about them. They got, average to above average intelligence, and they're just, OCD to an extreme. And their mood swings are horrible. They're manic phases. They peak at 10, they drop down to -10, they're back up to 10, back down to -10, and all over the place. So what they call mania, or manic phases, where they're real high. Hypomania, just a little bit less. They may be about a 7, come down to a 7, up to a 7. Where I break off for you guys out in the field is if the patient is showing me what we call psychotic features. Now, psychosis, the definition of psychosis is loss of reality. They've lost reality. They're talking as if they're on Pluto somewhere. They have exhibited to you that they are not only manic, but that they've lost touch with reality. Now, a lot of bipolar patients, a lot of schizophrenic patients have psychotic features to them, especially if they're drug abusers. Many of these patients are, obviously inhibited in their mental development because of the psychiatric illnesses. And so they tend to be of a little bit of a disadvantaged socioeconomic class. They're usually on disability and such, but they sit around the house most days. They can't hold down jobs, and they don't really function well within society, and subsequently they're outcasts. It's very tragic and very unfortunate. Mental illness in this country is very well underfunded and underrepresented. Quite frankly, are probably some of the biggest taxing issues, taxing from a standpoint of resource management that we deal with in this country today. Mental health is sucking us dry. And I don't mean from an economic standpoint. I mean just the resources that are piled into EMS and the police and then to the emergency department. It's killing us. And subsequently, without appropriate mental health treatment and without appropriate hospitalizations, these patients tend to be lost. And so as outcasts, they take their disability checks and such like that, and they buy methamphetamine, crack cocaine, K2, bath salts, and some of the other horrendioma drugs and paraphernalia that are out there. And they make their psychiatric illnesses much, much worse. This is a 1 + 1 = 3. You put schizophrenia or bipolar on top of methamphetamine, and you got yourself one wild ride, because these patients unmask their psychiatric illness and become very florid in their psychosis as well as their behaviors. These are easy patients. If it can be shown that you brought this patient in because they were acting in a psychotic manner, and you did so under involuntary consent. In other words, you forced this patient in, you tied them down to the stretcher, you medicated them and got them in. What's your best defense? Best defense is what you write on the chart and what you tell me in the emergency department. What do? I want to protect my EMS folks out there. I'm going to get drug screens, and I'm going to get alcohol levels, and we're going to get all kinds of panels on these people. And I'm going to get all kinds of tests that show that they were normal in these areas and abnormal here, and that the paramedics made the right decision. So involuntary consents, mostly with mental illnesses, psychiatric illnesses, in crisis, either compounded by or otherwise exacerbated by drugs, alcohol, or some sort of injury that unmasks their psychiatric illness. These are the greatest examples of involuntary consent. You will get one involuntary consent question on your national registry exam, and it's going to go something like this, that you've got a 18 to 25-year-old male, and as soon as you get that age range, that this person's a 19 or a 20-year-old male who's been acting bizarre, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you get that age range with that kind of scenario where the patient's acting bizarre, your answer is going to be, based on the analysis of your fact pattern, vital signs and mechanism of whatever happened that initiated the 911 call to begin with, you're going to get an involuntary consent situation. it's going to go something like that. We don't embed those. Those are actually pretty straightforward questions and such. So, all right. Well, unfortunately, it's a lawyer that's teaching this thing to you guys. I happen to do both law and medicine, although I don't prosecute anymore. But we've got a lot to share with you. I am very rigid about time constraints. And so I try to start on time, maybe a couple minutes late. But one thing I do not do is go into overtime. So at involuntary consent, we're going to break off. And I will talk with Jane about posting the next roundtable, which will be part 2 of medical, legal, and ethical issues. Now, I'm looking at the chat, and I want you guys to give me your one last round of questions, and then we will. Okay, James. Yep, I see you now.
Quick question, Dr. Frame. If a person has been tased by the police and then you subsequently restrain them to the stretcher, the original involuntary consent was attributed to police or to the EMS, or does it even matter?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Either way, if the police felt it necessary that they had to use a judicial restraint, in other words, taser, it would be this is a judicial restraint, involuntary consent, and that's a great question. But we do run into tase incidences a lot. Again, know that in this particular case, police officers have tased. They want the patient checked out. So from a medical legal protection standpoint, it's easier to pay their medical bills than to deal with a death or a permanent disability later because you didn't seek treatment from taser. So yes, these guys will have to, at a time where they've just been tased, they're going to have to be tied down in a stretcher and brought in. I have no problems with that. And you're completely defensible.
Great, thank you.
No problem. All right, Scott, Priscilla, Carrie, anybody else have a question? No, sir, from Carrie. All right. James has already responded. Scott, you got a question? Priscilla, you got a question? No, sir, it's been covered well so far. No, sir, very good. All right, I expect to see you all my next roundtable. We've got a lot more to go through. A lot of this is going to be fun. I'll pinpoint the questions for you as best as I can without giving you the actual question. And at least you can count on at least 6 questions correct when it comes to consent issues.
Hey, Dr. Frame.
Yeah.
I got Dr. Eschelbach going to do a roundtable Monday night, and then you're scheduled on August the 3rd. So when you look at your schedule, kind of keep those in mind, and then let me know what you've got open. I won't be available on Tuesday either because I'll be traveling, but after that, I'll be back in business. Yeah,
no problem. I'll shoot you some Friday dates because these are best for me, and then we'll get part 2 of this coming up. What's he teaching Monday?
He didn't tell me. He just said he wanted to teach Monday night.
Okay,
you could shoot him an email, and maybe if you want him to pick up and keep working, or you want him to teach something else, that's fine. Y'all just let me know what I'm doing, and I'm happy.
Yeah, he's a smart guy, and he should be teaching medical kind of stuff. This medical legal stuff. This is what I do. And so,
Yeah, his are normally medical emergencies, airway, cardiac. He did a really good cardiac lecture last time. So, and EKGs, he's done a couple where he's been teaching them to pick out 12 leads, and he's had EMTs on here picking out 12 leads on these 1-hour webinars. It's amazing.
Well, it's his job to teach these guys how to save patients' rear ends. And my job as a lawyer is to make sure I save the paramedics' rear end. So,
right. Yes, so James, this coming Monday night, same time, same station. I'll post the link on Monday.
Great, thank you.
All right.
All right, guys, take care. Have a great night.
Thank you. Appreciate it.